December 13th, 1943, 9:27 a.m. One lone P-40 Warhawk climbs over Assam, India, facing 64 Japanese aircraft. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair had no backup. Below him, Denjin Airfield brims with wounded soldiers, burning fuel, and critical supply planes, every lifeline for the Allied war effort. Reinforcements were 38 minutes away. The bombers were seconds from release. Outnumbered 64-1, Adair tightened his grip on the throttle, feeling the roar of his engine and the weight of the world pressing down. One shot, one decision, one man against impossible odds. Could he stop them? Or was this the end? At just 23 years old, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair had already completed 43 combat missions with the 89th Fighter Squadron, safeguarding the perilous Hump airlift. Yet on this morning, fate left him alone in the skies as a massive Japanese formation appeared on the horizon. In the past 2 months, relentless raids across northeast India had wiped out 47 Allied transport aircraft and claimed 112 lives. Adair's P-40, famously called Lulu Bell and bearing the number 44, was armed with 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, enough ammunition for barely 12 seconds of continuous fire. Ahead, 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, shielded by roughly 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. Fighters stacked above and below were closing in fast. Intelligence reports warned that similar-sized raids over Burma had achieved devastating 90% strike rates on undefended airfields. Beneath Adair, Denjin Airfield sprawled with 14 C-47 transport planes loaded with vital supplies destined for Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China, a field hospital caring for 63 wounded soldiers, and fuel reserves enough to sustain Hump operations for nearly 2 weeks. If the bombers reached their target unchallenged, the disruption would cripple Allied supply lines across the Himalayas for weeks. The closest Allied fighters were stationed 38 minutes away at Jorhat. Adair glanced at his fuel gauge. Full internal tanks, 180 gallons, roughly 90 minutes of combat-ready flight. Below him, the Japanese formation flew 3,000 feet lower, closing in at 240 miles per hour. Standard tactics dictated waiting for backup when outnumbered 5-1. Adair faced odds of 64-1. Adair had a choice: radio for reinforcements and trail the enemy until help arrived, but by then, the bombs would be raining down. Or he could take the fight into his own hands, striking alone to throw the raid into chaos. He shoved the throttle forward. The Allison V1710 engine roared to life, manifold pressure climbing to 54 inches. The P-40 surged to 320 miles per hour as he maneuvered 4,000 feet above the bomber formation. Approaching from the south, with the sun blazing behind him, his advantage in surprise. The Oscars still hadn't spotted him. Their focus remained locked on Denjin Airfield, certain that no American fighter would challenge them this far from the target. That gave Adair one priceless advantage: surprise. In a heartbeat, he mapped out his attack. Hit the lead bomber group first, ignore the escort fighters, disrupt their tight formation, and break their bombing accuracy before they could reach the airfield. If he could scatter them, he might force the entire raid to collapse. one P-40 against 64 Japanese aircraft, a lone pilot, preparing to stop an attack no one else could. The lead Sally bombers flew in a tight formation, 6 aircraft arranged in 2 perfect Vs of 3. Adair rolled his P-40 inverted, pulled the nose down, and dove toward them from a 7 o'clock high position. His airspeed climbed rapidly, 360 miles per hour, as the Allison engine screamed at full power. Closing the distance fast, he remained unseen by the bomber crews. At 800 yards, he unleashed a burst from his sigh. 50 caliber machine guns. Tracers stitched through the sky, hammering the lead bomber. Fabric ripped and metal sparked as rounds tore across the aircraft's left wing, sending the formation into chaos. The bomber's port engine ignited in a burst of orange flame, black smoke billowing from the cowling. The formation fractured instantly, bombers scattering left and right as their tight V dissolved into chaos. Adair yanked the stick hard, pulling up under 7 Gs that pinned him to his seat, then rolled sharply to the right. Behind him, 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters dived in pursuit. One of the most agile planes in the Pacific Theater, the Oscar's Nakajima HA-115 engine produced 1,150 horsepower, propelling it to 329 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, while executing turning circles tighter than any American fighter. The Oscar's butterfly combat flaps let them bleed speed rapidly in tight turns without stalling, a deadly advantage that Japanese pilots exploited with ruthless precision. In the past 6 months alone, these nimble fighters had downed 63 Allied aircraft over Burma and northeast India. Adair's P-40N Warhawk had the edge in straight-line speed, but it could never match the Oscars in a turning fight. Powered by its Allison V1710-81 engine, producing 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, the Warhawk could reach a maximum of 378 miles per hour below 12,000 feet, fast, but not enough to outmaneuver its deadly pursuers in a dogfight. In a prolonged turning fight, the heavier P-40 would bleed energy far faster than the nimble Japanese fighters. Standard tactics were simple. Never match an Oscar in a turn. Strike with speed, hit and run, then extend and reset. But Adair had no room to escape. If he pulled back, the bombers would reform and complete their deadly run on Denjen Airfield. He had to stay in the fight, keep the enemy scattered, keep them unsettled, even if it meant taking on 40 Oscars alone. The stakes were clear. The lives on the ground and the supply line rested entirely on his shoulders. The first 4 Oscars dove toward him in a loose finger 4 formation from his 10 o'clock high. Adair rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a brief 2-second burst at the lead fighter. But his 50 caliber rounds sailed high. The Oscar banked sharply to the right, its wingman following in pursuit. Adair reversed and dove away to maintain his speed, only to spot 2 more Oscars diving from above. Closing to 400 yards, he pulled into a climbing left turn and fired again. Still no hits. His ammunition counter read 800 rounds across all 6 guns, enough for roughly 6 more attacks at this rate. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were regrouping. 3 groups of 6, closing back into their deadly V formation. If they succeeded, the attack on Denjin airfield would continue unimpeded. Adair had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached their release point. He rolled out, slammed the throttle forward, and dove toward the bombers once more. 8 Oscars streaked after him, but the P-40 surged to 405 miles per hour in the dive, leaving the nimble Japanese fighters struggling to keep pace. In that brief, terrifying moment, speed was his only ally against overwhelming odds. Adair opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand sally formation. At 300 yards, he fired, tracers streaking toward the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi HA-101 radial exploded in a towering fireball, and the bomber rolled violently, shedding fire and debris. Its wingman veered off to avoid collision, while Adair kicked the rudder, skidded left, and fired at another sally. His rounds tore through the bomber's thin fuselage. There was no armor for the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Designed in 1936, the Ki-21 was obsolete by 1943 standards, yet still capable of dropping 2,250 pounds of bombs, enough to devastate Denjin. 12 Oscars were already closing in, and Adair's gauges warned him. 162 gallons of fuel remaining, 650 rounds across 6 guns. Each shot, each maneuver, precious. The bombers were just 19 miles from Denjin, leaving Adair with barely 4 minutes before they reached drop range. Then a new danger emerged. His engine began overheating. The Allison V1710-81, a liquid-cooled powerhouse, relied on coolant circulating through passages in the cylinder heads and engine block to absorb combustion heat, then flowing through a radiator beneath the fuselage. At combat settings above 50 inches of manifold pressure, the engine generated punishing temperatures, pushing both machine and pilot to the absolute limit as he raced against time and an advancing enemy formation. The P-40's coolant system was built to handle sustained, full-power flight for roughly 20 minutes. Adair had been pushing the engine at maximum for 11. His gauge read 230 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the normal 210 degrees Fahrenheit, but below the 250 degrees Fahrenheit threshold where catastrophic failure would begin. He had 3 choices: reduce power and risk letting the bombers reach Denjin unchallenged, abandon the attack and return to base, or press on and risk the engine failing over enemy territory. With the Sally bombers now 17 miles from their target and still a deadly threat, Adair kept the throttle wide open. 2 Oscars surged toward him head-on, forcing him into instant action. The closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. Both Oscars opened fire at 500 yards. Adair caught the glint of muzzle flashes, 7.7 millimeter tracers streaking straight toward his nose. He fired back, his heavier .50 caliber rounds carrying far more energy and range. At 350 yards, his bullets tore into the left Oscar's engine cowling. The nimble fighter shuddered violently, broke left, and trailed white coolant vapor, its wingman breaking off in pursuit. Adair rolled hard to the right and dove, coolant temperature spiking to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Below him, The Sally bombers were now just 15 miles from Denjen, the threat as immediate as ever. Two formations of 6 bombers each had reassembled into tight Vs, while a third group struggled to regroup, 3 aircraft lagging behind. Adair targeted the lead formation once more. 6 Oscars dove to intercept him, but he rocketed past at 390 miles per hour. Far too fast for the nimble fighters to follow. At bomber altitude, he leveled the P-40 and unleashed a burst on the lead Sally. His rounds struck the right wing, compromising its structure. The outer panel tore upward and peeled away, sending the bomber into an inverted spin. No parachutes, no escape, only fire and chaos. The doomed crew rode the spinning bomber down as the formation shattered once again. Bombers scattered in 3 directions, their bombing accuracy obliterated. Even if they released their payloads now, the bombs would fall across miles of jungle rather than striking Denjen airfield. Adair yanked the stick hard, but the P-40 was sending urgent warnings. The coolant gauge read 248 degrees Fahrenheit. The engine running rough, vibrations thrumming through the controls. Detonation had begun in the cylinders, pre-ignition caused by excessive heat. If he didn't reduce power soon, the engine would seize, leaving him stranded over enemy territory. 8 Oscars dove from above, catching Adair almost by surprise. He rolled left, but it was too slow. 7.7 millimeter rounds tore through his right wing, ripping fabric and buckling metal. One struck the right aileron control rod, leaving the controls sluggish. He needed extra pressure just to keep level. Another burst struck the fuselage, sparking off the engine cowling. One round pierced the coolant reservoir behind the firewall, spraying green fluid across the windscreen. The engine temperature soared past 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam hissed from the cowling seams, oil pressure plummeted, and the Allison was dying. Adair chopped the throttle. RPM dropped from 3,000 to 2,400, insufficient to maintain altitude. The P-40 began a rapid descent, 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. The Oscars circled above, waiting, and then the engine caught fire. In a liquid-cooled aircraft, flames followed a predictable sequence. First, burning coolant, vaporized and ignited. Then the fire spread forward along the cowling, driven by the rushing air. If the fire reached the fuel lines running along the engine's left side, the P-40 would erupt in a deadly explosion. Adair had barely 30 seconds to act. Standard procedure for an engine fire called for an immediate shutdown and bailout. But he was at only 8,000 feet, descending fast, and 12 miles from friendly territory over dense jungle, patrolled by Japanese forces. He made a split-second decision: keep the engine running. Using the Allison's manual fuel mixture controls, he began leaning it carefully. Trying to keep the fire in check while maintaining enough power to stay airborne, Adair pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 tense seconds, starving the engine of fuel. The flames subsided slightly. He pushed the mixture forward again. The Allison coughed, caught, and continued running, but rough, strained. Power output had dropped to roughly 60%, enough only to maintain level flight, far too little to climb. He was committed. fly a burning, damaged aircraft back to safety, or bail out over hostile territory. The Sally bombers were 13 miles from Denjin, still close enough to turn back, but their formations had collapsed. Individual bombers veered southeast, retreating toward Burma. The raid had been broken. Denjin Airfield was safe. Adair turned southwest toward his base at Naguli, 43 miles away, roughly 15 minutes of flight if the engine held together. 6 Oscars trailed him, relentless. At 7,000 feet, his engine oil pressure plummeted to 0. The Allison relied on that pressure to lubricate its connecting rods, crankshaft, and camshaft. Without it, metal ground against metal, friction spiked, heat built, and components began to expand and seize. Adair felt the vibration through the controls intensify, each pulse a warning. The engine could fail completely at any moment. The propeller began windmilling unevenly, sapping what little power remained. Airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour. Dangerously close to the P-40's stall speed of 120. He was scraping the edge between controlled flight and a freefall. Behind him, the 6 Oscars closed to 400 yards, circling silently. They didn't fire, just watched, waiting for the engine to quit, for him to bail out or crash. One fighter drew alongside, close enough for Adair to see the pilot's face. The Japanese pilot gestured downward. Land, surrender, become a prisoner. Adair didn't flinch. He ignored the warning and held his course. At 6,000 feet, smoke began to fill Adair's cockpit, not from the engine, but from severed electrical wiring behind the instrument panel. Rounds that had torn through his fuselage had damaged control cables and the electrical system. The acrid smoke burned his eyes and throat. He slid the canopy open. The wind blast cleared some of it, but the slipstream made each breath a struggle. Airspeed dropped to 160 miles per hour. The Oscars backed off, unwilling to waste ammunition. The American pilot was already dead in the sky. His aircraft was crippled, the engine failing. He seemed destined to crash in the jungle. The enemy circled higher, observing as he descended. At 4,000 feet, the right aileron control cable snapped. The aileron flopped to full deflection, sending the P-40 rolling right and the nose plunging into a dive. Adair yanked on the stick with both hands. Nothing. The elevator cables were damaged. He had no pitch control. The nose stayed down. Airspeed climbed 200, 220, 250 mph. The jungle rushed toward him. Altitude fell rapidly. 3,000, 2,500, 2,000 feet. He was certain he would crash. Then, in a desperate flash of ingenuity, he had an idea. The P-40's damaged right aileron forced the wing downward, while the broken elevator cables held the horizontal stabilizer in a permanent nose-down position. Gravity and aerodynamic forces were dragging the aircraft into an uncontrollable dive. But aerodynamics can work in unexpected ways. If Adair rolled the plane inverted, the damaged aileron would lift the right wing instead of forcing it down, and the stuck elevator would push the tail lower, raising the nose. Flying upside down would reverse the control inputs, giving him a slim chance to wrest back some measure of control from the crippled aircraft. The very damage that was condemning him right side up might become his salvation inverted. At 1,800 feet above the jungle, Adair rolled the P-40 completely upside down. -1 G pressed him into the shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head, and the edges of his vision reddened. The fuel system, designed for positive G operation, struggled to feed the Allison engine while inverted. It coughed, sputtered, nearly stalled, but then caught again, running rough yet producing enough power. Slowly, the nose began to lift, and the frantic descent eased, giving him a fragile chance at survival. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, flying upside down at 140 miles per hour. Adair maintained the inverted attitude for 40 tense seconds. Airspeed climbed to 160 miles per hour, and slowly, painfully, he began gaining altitude about 50 feet per minute. Then the fuel starvation issue returned. The engine started cutting out. He rolled the aircraft right side up. Immediately, the damaged controls drove the nose downward, and the P-40 plunged once more at 600 feet per minute. Waiting until he had lost 300 feet, Adair rolled inverted again, and miraculously, the nose lifted, buying him precious time above the jungle canopy. He clawed 200 feet of altitude before fuel starvation forced him upright again. The pattern repeated, upside down to climb, right side up to feed the engine. Flip, climb. Flip, descend. Flip, climb. Above him, the 6 Oscars circled, watching this impossible spectacle. An American P-40, engine burning, controls shattered, alternating between inverted and upright flight, refusing to crash, fighting for every inch of altitude like a wounded animal unwilling to die. One Oscar dove to investigate, only for Adair to roll inverted, gain height, then roll upright directly at the Japanese fighter. The Oscar veered away, defeated by sheer audacity. The American pilot was either insane or utterly desperate. Either way, the Oscars refused to engage and turned east, back toward Burma. Adair continued his grueling rolling climb toward Nguli. His fuel gauge read 83 gallons, but the oil pressure needle had been pegged at 0 for 9 long minutes. By all mechanical logic, the Allison should have seized. Connecting rods should have fused to the crankshaft. Yet it kept running, fueled by momentum, friction, and whatever microscopic oil film remained. Slowly, painfully, he gained altitude. 3,000 feet, then 4,000, defying every expectation. Nguli Airfield lay 21 miles to the southwest, roughly 11 minutes away if he could maintain his fragile speed. The coolant temperature gauge no longer registered. The needle had melted away long ago. Smoke still poured from the cowling, but the flames had largely died down. Either the fire had consumed all available fuel, or the lack of coolant had starved it. At 5,000 feet, Adair finally spotted the airfield. The runway, the control tower, the revetments, safety within sight. But a new challenge awaited. The P-40's landing gear was hydraulically operated, and with the system damaged, there was no guarantee it would extend. The P-40's hydraulic system relied on engine power, and his engine was barely producing enough, ready to quit at any second. Lowering the gear now risked a catastrophic crash short of the runway if the engine failed. Keeping it up meant attempting a belly landing, with the impact likely rupturing fuel tanks and igniting the aircraft. He needed the gear down and locked before power gave out. Reaching for the lever, his right hand shook, not from fear, but from 14 minutes of carbon monoxide poisoning, as cockpit smoke filled the cabin. He pulled the lever down. Nothing. The P-40's hydraulic system relied on engine-driven pressure, 1,000 pounds per square inch of hydraulic fluid, flowing through steel lines to actuators that extended and retracted the landing gear. With the engine barely producing power, the pump couldn't generate enough pressure, leaving the gear locked firmly in the up position. Fortunately, the aircraft had a backup, a manual hand pump mounted on the left side of the cockpit. 28 deliberate strokes of the handle would pressurize the system enough to lower the landing gear. A painstaking task under the stress of a failing engine and a smoking cockpit. Adair grabbed the hand pump with his left hand, keeping his right firmly on the control stick. He began pumping. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. The gear stubbornly refused to budge. Normally, effective operation required both hands, but letting go of the stick now would send the damaged ailerons and elevator plunging the nose downward. Thinking fast, he reached behind his seat, unbuckled his lap belt, and wrapped it around the control stick, threading it through the seat frame and pulling it tight. The makeshift rig held the stick in a near-neutral position, allowing him to attempt the hand crank procedure without losing what little control he had left. It wasn't perfect control, but enough to keep the P-40 flying straight. Adair grabbed the hand pump with both hands and cranked hard. 5 strokes, 10, 15. At stroke 23, he felt resistance. Hydraulic pressure was building. By stroke 28, a satisfying thunk echoed beneath the cockpit. The left main gear dropped and locked, followed 3 seconds later by the right. With the landing gear down, drag surged dramatically, and airspeed plummeted from 160 to 135 miles per hour. Still above stall speed, but dangerously close. Every second now mattered as he prepared for the final, most perilous phase of his flight. The engine now produced barely 40% power, just enough to maintain altitude with the landing gear down. Naguli's runway lay 7 miles ahead, roughly 3 minutes away if the fragile Allison held together. Adair's vision narrowed. Gray shadows crept in from the edges as carbon monoxide poisoning clouded his mind. He shook his head, forcing focus on the runway ahead. 6 miles. The engine temperature gauge, the only one still functioning, read 310 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond the red line. Metal components were expanding from the heat, tolerances closing, each second bringing him closer to mechanical failure over the unforgiving jungle. Any second, a piston could seize, a valve could stick, or a connecting rod could snap. 5 miles out, Nguli's tower operators spotted him, a P-40 trailing smoke, flying erratically with landing gear down. They assumed he would follow standard landing procedures, lower the flaps, reduce speed, touch down on the main wheels first. But Adair's flaps were hydraulically operated as well. With the engine barely producing power, he couldn't generate enough pressure to operate both gear and flaps, leaving him with one of the most dangerous landings imaginable. The landing gear was down, but the flaps stayed up. A landing without flaps meant a higher touchdown speed, 120 miles instead of 90, which translated to a longer landing roll. Nguli's runway was 4,000 feet long. A flapless landing in a crippled aircraft required at least 3,000 feet, achievable only if he maintained speed and touched down smoothly. At 2 miles from the runway, the engine quit. The propeller windmilled to a stop. No power, no thrust. The P-40 became a glider, a very poor glider. With a glide ratio of roughly 8-to-1, 2,000 feet of altitude gave him just enough range to cover 3 miles. The runway was only 2 miles away. Theoretically, it was possible, but the P-40 was far from a textbook aircraft now. Battle damage had added drag. Bullet holes in the wings and fuselage disrupted airflow, reducing its glide ratio to perhaps 6-to-1. He wasn't going to make the runway. He was headed for the jungle, crashing just shy of safety. After surviving 64 Japanese aircraft, flying inverted for 11 minutes, and nursing a dying engine for 15, he faced the cruelest twist. The engine had quit at the worst possible moment, and he would crash barely 200 yards from the runway that had seemed so close. Then, a memory from training surfaced. Something his instructor had said about the P-40's glide performance. Something about flying inverted. In a normal glide, the aircraft descends nose first, gravity pulling it down while the wings generate lift. But inverted, the aerodynamics reversed. The wing camber, designed to lift when right side up, now generated downward force, but at precise angles of attack, this reversal produced less drag than flying right side up. Adair realized he might have a last, slim chance. Use the inverted glide to stretch his remaining altitude and reach the runway. An inverted glide could theoretically extend his range by reducing drag, a principle mentioned briefly in training, but no instructor ever expected a pilot to use it in real combat. Adair had nothing to lose. At 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway, he rolled the P-40 inverted. Blood rushed to his head. Vision reddened, but he held the attitude, watching the jungle pass disorientingly beneath or above him. Airspeed steadied at 125 miles per hour. The descent rate slowed to 500 feet per minute, far better than the 700 feet per minute he had been experiencing right side up. Nguli tower operators watched in disbelief as a P-40 approached inverted, landing gear extended. Gear down while inverted was aerodynamically unnatural and structurally taxing. The doors designed to withstand forces from below now faced loads from above, but the gear held. The P-40 pressed its inverted approach toward the runway. On the ground, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez watched through binoculars, witnessing a landing unlike any he had ever seen. Through his binoculars, Martinez saw the inverted aircraft, landing gear extended, smoke trailing from the engine. For a moment, he thought a Japanese pilot had stolen a P-40 and was attempting to strafe the airfield. He sprinted toward the nearest .50 caliber machine gun position, 3 ground crew members following close behind. They reached the emplacement and began traversing the weapon toward the approaching plane. Meanwhile, Adair was at 400 feet, just half a mile from the runway threshold, still inverted. His vision narrowed. Gray tunnels closed in from the periphery as carbon monoxide and exhaustion took their toll. Carbon monoxide and the strain of negative G-forces were shutting down his brain. Adair had perhaps 20 seconds of consciousness left. He needed to roll upright, line up with the runway, and land. Too soon, and the damaged controls would drive the nose down, crashing him short. Too late, and he would overshoot. At 200 feet, 300 yards from the threshold, he rolled right side up. The damaged aileron immediately pushed the right wing down. He countered with left stick, forcing the wings level. The nose wanted to dive. He pulled back on the stick. The broken elevator cables gave only partial control, just enough. The P-40 descended steeply, nose high. Wings wobbling, smoke trailing from the engine. Martinez's gun crew tracked the aircraft, uncertain if it was friend or foe. In 3 seconds, the aircraft would cross the runway threshold. Martinez had a split-second decision: shoot or hold fire. He held fire. Adair's P-40 crossed the threshold at 90 feet, descending rapidly, too fast, too steep. In 4 seconds, it dropped the final 90 feet. The main wheels slammed into the concrete with a 7G impact, the gear struts compressing fully. The tail wheel struck hard. Metal screamed as the right main gear collapsed. The right wing dropped, and the wingtip gouged into the runway. The aircraft ground-looped to the right, spinning 180 degrees, sending sparks and fragments of concrete flying. It skidded backward for 200 feet before coming to a halt, smoke billowing from the engine compartment. Fire crews sprinted toward the crippled plane. Inside the cockpit, Adair sat motionless for 12 seconds. Then he released his shoulder straps, pushed himself up, and climbed onto the wing. His legs buckled beneath him, but he caught himself on the wing root. Ground crew reached him and guided him safely to the ground. Martinez arrived moments later with the fire crew and pried open the engine cowling. The Allison engine was a total loss. Pistons seized, crankshaft warped, oil pan ruptured, coolant spilled across the airframe. Adair walked around the P-40 with Martinez, surveying the devastation. 16 bullet holes pocked the fuselage. 7 tore through the right wing. 4 through the left. 1 round had completely severed the right aileron control cable. Another punctured the hydraulic reservoir, and a third sliced through 2 electrical bundles behind the instrument panel. The engine had suffered catastrophic damage from overheating and oil starvation. Every cylinder scored, 3 connecting rods welded to the crankshaft. The aircraft was a mechanical graveyard, yet its pilot had survived. The coolant system was ruined. Lulubelle would never fly again. Yet Philip Adair had accomplished the impossible. Dingen Airfield was saved. Intelligence reports confirmed the staggering outcome. All 24 Sally bombers had turned back without releasing a single bomb. The Japanese formation scattered 15 miles short of the target. Their 40 Oscar fighters escorting the empty bombers back to Burma. No Allied facilities were hit. No personnel were lost. All 14 C-47 transports remained fully operational, and the hump airlift continued without interruption, a lifeline across the Himalayas preserved by one pilot's courage. On December 16, 1943, just 3 days after the mission, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Philip Adair about the engagement. He recounted every detail: the attack sequence, the inverted flying technique, the perilous landing approach. Flight surgeons examined him and found carbon monoxide levels in his blood still dangerously elevated, 72 hours after the mission. They concluded he had been flying under severe poisoning for the final 11 minutes of his flight, levels that should have rendered any pilot unconscious. Yet Adair had not only survived, he had saved an entire airfield. He had somehow remained functional through sheer willpower. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater, presented Second Lieutenant Philip Adair with the Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against enemy forces on December 13, 1943, when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft attacking Allied installations. Continuing his attack despite severe aircraft damage and personal risk, thereby preventing the destruction of critical supply facilities. Adair went on to fly 95 more combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group, achieving ace status with 5 confirmed kills. On his final mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 Ki-43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned to the United States in September 1944, survived the war, and continued his Air Force career for 30 years, retiring as a full colonel in 1971. The 80th Fighter Group, known as the Burma Banshees, carried on operations until August 1945, destroying 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 on the ground. Adair's heroism and the legacy of his unit endured long after the war ended. The unit lost 63 pilots killed or missing in action, yet their death's head skull insignia became one of the most recognized symbols in the China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the fame of the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. Slower than both and limited above 15,000 feet, by 1943 it was considered obsolete. Yet in the hands of resolute pilots like Philip Adair, the rugged Curtiss fighter proved a timeless lesson. In combat, determination, skill, and courage mattered far more than the specifications on paper. It was the courage, skill, and sheer determination of the pilot that made all the difference. One pilot, flying one obsolete fighter, against 64 enemy aircraft on December 13, 1943, proved that impossible odds mean nothing when someone refuses to quit. Philip Adair's solution to damaged controls, flying alternately inverted and upright for 11 minutes, defied every standard flying procedure. His inverted landing approach, with gear extended, had never been attempted before and was never repeated. That is the story of the Burma Banshees and the day a single P-40 pilot disrupted an entire Japanese raid. If stories like this remind you why preserving history matters, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten heroes, and turn on notifications so you never miss these tales. Drop a comment to share where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the CBI theater. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.